Hi everyone, I'm back to do another book review. This book review is going to be, it's a little delayed and I apologize. I have been extremely busy, but it's a few months off, so again, I apologize for that. But this book review is going to be on Dirty Daddy by Bob Saget. I read this, I think, in the beginning of the year, right after he died. When I heard about it, I've had it on my shelf for many, many years. I just got extremely busy. I just never got around to reading it in its entirety. So I finally sat down and read it in its entirety. But this book was so good. It was so entertaining. It was very, very good. He covered a lot. I thought there was going to be more in it. He covered more than I thought he would. He covered Full House. He covered his life. He covered his sister's passing. He covered everything he did. He basically, for everyone who doesn't know, who hasn't read his memoir, it came out in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Normally there's a date. I don't know. Yes, it came out in 2014. I read, when this first came out, he did a talk at the 92nd Street Y. I actually didn't know about it, so I didn't go. But I watched his talk. John Oliver interviewed him. But like I said, for those who don't know what this book is, he covers a lot about his sister passing. He covered that he started out as a stand-up comedian and went through that while he was on Full House. He also did America's Funniest Home Videos while he was on Full House, so he could also still do comedy and do America's Funniest Home Videos at the same time. And so he could still do comedy there as well. He covered the process of getting Full House and how he got Full House and that in its entirety. He went on to talk about his sister, like I said, his sister. He talked about his sister a lot in this. It was very interesting. He talked about how he met his first wife. Before he got Full House, he was a very unknown comedian. People knew about him, but they didn't really know about him. He actually did work in news, which I didn't know. And his which I found a little interesting, only because his character, Danny Tanner, on Full House, hosted Wake Up San Francisco with John Stamos' wife, and before she became his wife on the show. So that was a little interesting to learn about in this book. He also went on to talk about that while he was auditioning before he got Full House, he not only was doing new stuff, but he was also at a nightclub every single night doing comedy. And then he wasn't, which I knew, but he talked about it more thoroughly in the book. He wasn't originally, the funniest thing was, he wasn't for those who also don't know, he wasn't originally cast as Danny Tanner. John Posey he's actually Dylan Posey's dad, and I'm sure all of you know Taylor Posey, forgive me. he's Taylor Posey's dad, which I'm sure a lot of you know from the I cannot think of what TV show he was on, but he's Tyler Posey's dad because Bob Saget had a prior commitment, so he couldn't originally play the role as Danny Tanner. So that's why they had to cast somebody else. And then once Bob Saget became available, he then took over because I think he had another pilot that he was filming. And then once he became available, he then, they were able to cast him as Danny Tanner. And they reshot the pilot, and the rest is history, basically. So, so he talked more about that. He talks about that in depth in the book, which I also found very, very interesting. Because I knew he wasn't originally cast as Danny Tanner. I just didn't know the circumstances around why. He was also in another sitcom after Full House ended that I cannot think of the name of. But I hear it's very good. I just haven't watched it. He also talked a lot about his life after Full House ended, after they canceled it. He went on to talk about how after Full House ended, he and his wife ended up getting divorced. And he also went on to talk about how he had to go back to doing comedy because also while he was on Full House, he was also hosting America's Funniest Home Videos to still do his stand-up at the same time, to still pursue comedy. And he also went in depth to talk about the Olsen twins as well. He said that he actually had to be careful what he said on set when none of the kids were around, when Jodie Sweetin wasn't around, when Candace Cameron Bure wasn't around. Well, at the time she was Candace Cameron. And when the Olsen twins weren't around because they were babies. So he mentioned this in his 92nd Street Y talk, that he went on to say when Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, when Mary-Kate Olsen and Ashley Olsen were babies, he went on to say that when they weren't on set during rehearsals, he had to talk to a doll and do his scenes with a doll, which I found a little interesting because I just thought it was an interesting thing. And then he also had to watch what he said because every now and then, like Jodie Sweetin's mother and Candace Cameron's mother and the Olsen twins' mother were on set while they did rehearsals. So he had to make sure he was careful of what he said. But as a comedian, him and Dave Coulier were really comedians. John Stamos really wasn't a comedian all that much when he went in depth about it in the book. But he went on to say they also had to be careful what they said because they didn't know who was around. So I found that very interesting because I've heard so many different things about what happened on set from what I've read online. So I heard that there was a beef with everybody, but apparently there wasn't. Because he talked a lot about that in the book as well. But I found it very, very interesting. He also he went on to also do a lot of guest starring roles on TV shows after Full House ended. He also talked about that he didn't have to work a lot after Full House ended because, well, he did, but once Full House went into syndication and it went out in reruns, because at the time Full House was also in reruns, that once the reruns became very, very popular and everybody was watching them, he didn't have to work a lot. He always got residual checks from it, and he also went on to say at that time, when compared to now, which I thought was very interesting, when people were signing contracts for stuff, for TV shows, everybody on Full House made so much money back then that now it's not the same. Because he was recently on, before he died, he did his stand-up, and but at the time of this being published, he just did a guest starring role on a TV show that I can't think of off the top of my head. But I watched it and it was very good. I'm sure it'll say on IMDb what all of them were. I just can't think of what he did off the top of his head. It will say the sitcom he was on after Full House ended on his IMDb, because Kat Dennings was in it as well. So if you also look up Kat Dennings' IMDb page, it would be there as well. But he also went on. I think he guest starred on an episode of 8 Simple Rules, because he talked about how he was friends with John Ritter also during that time, because John Ritter was also a comedian, but then in the early 2000s, John Ritter got 8 Simple Rules, and he became, like, his character became like a family man, like Danny Tanner's character did. So they bonded a lot over that as well. And he was also, at that time, his new show was also on at the same time 8 Simple Rules was. So that's when they became, like, very good friends. But he knew him from the comedy world. And he also went on a little bit. He also guest starred on John Stamos' show Grandfathered. So he talked about forming a relationship with Josh Peck, which I also found very, very interesting. But that's what he basically covered a lot of. He also talked about how he met his now wife, Kelly Rizzo. He was dating her, but he didn't really go on to talk about a lot about it. He also went on to talk about, he talked a lot about his family in this book as well, but it was very, very fast-paced. It was a very, very quick read. I think I finished it in 2 days, but this is a very fast-paced book that you could probably read in 1 or 2 sittings. I think I read it in, like, 2 days, so I didn't read it in, like, 1 or 2 sittings, but it's very fast-paced. But if you're a huge fan of Full House like myself, I would highly recommend reading this book. And it was very good. I'm sure it's cheap on Amazon now. So I'm sure you could find it cheap. I actually found it at a used bookstore near my house for $5 in hardcover. So when I found it, I snatched it up. And I was so excited to find it because I really wanted to read it. And like I said, I just never got around to it because I was so busy. But then I finally got around to reading it. It's a shame I'm never going to be able to meet him. But, you know, it's okay. But I was very excited to read this. I will probably reread this at some point. Because if I reread it, I might see other things that I didn't notice the first time around that I read it. But that's my review of Dirty Daddy by Bob Saget. A wrap-up for this book is you can read it where the places you can read it are on a plane. If you're on a vacation and you need a quick read, you can bring this with you then as well. You can read it if you're going someplace and you need, like, a quick read as well. You can read it on a train. You can read it, like, on a bus going to work or the train going to work. It'll take you literally 2 to 3 days to read this book because it is very, very fast-paced and a very, very quick read to read. Like I said, I read it in 2 days and I got through it very quickly. And I do recommend watching his 92nd Street Y video interview talk that John Oliver interviewed him on, because that is very, very interesting to read, because he goes in depth about a lot of stuff in that. So I watched that after I read this, and I found out more than I ever did before, because there was some stuff he went into that he didn't go into in the book. So that was very entertaining and interesting to read, to watch as well. Alrighty, guys, that was my book review of Dirty Daddy by Bob Saget. Let me know in the comments if you have read this, if you are interested in reading it, if you have read any of the other books by any of the other people from Full House. John Stamos is actually writing his memoir is actually coming out next year, so I'm very excited to read his book to get his take on what it was like being on Full House. So I'm very excited to read that as well. So that's it. I will see you guys in another video soon. Goodbye.